The Middle East is once again what everyone is talking about. And as if time did not move on, Israel is once again at the epicenter of the conflict. Yes, VisualPolitik community, Israel is at war again.
Israel formally declares war against Hamas as it battles to push militants off its soil.
Fortunately for the Hebrew country, this is not like those wars of the 1960s and the 1970s, where several Arab countries suddenly attacked Israel. For the moment, it is more reminiscent of the wars Israel waged against Lebanon in 1982 and 2006 in an attempt to wipe out the Palestine Liberation Organization and Hezbollah, respectively. But what if I told you that this mess could turn into an open war between several countries? It probably wouldn't come as a surprise. After all, it wouldn't be the first time this has happened in the Middle East, or to Israel in particular. But let me ask you a question. Which country could be the first to declare war on the Hebrew state? Well, most likely the one that is already knocking on the door.
Iran's warning to the UN, if Israel invades Gaza, we will intervene. We have our finger on the trigger.
Indeed, VisualPolitik community, Iran has already sent some warnings about a possible war with Israel, and this is no small thing. Think about it. Iran is one of the three major regional powers in the Middle East, along with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it has a considerable military capability. However, while this may come as a major shock at the international level, analysts are already warning of a particularly worrying possibility. If Iran were to go to war with Israel, the United States would most certainly be drawn into the conflict, and for many, this would be the preamble to a much larger conflict. And that has caused us here on VisualPolitik to ask ourselves a few questions. What have relations between Iran and the United States been like? Why is the United States so concerned about a possible Iranian intervention in Israel? Would the United States actually attack the Islamic Republic? And more importantly, would it succeed? Today we're going to answer these questions, but first let's start at the beginning of the story.
In free fall.
That Iran and the United States despise each other is nothing new. It has been the case for several decades. However, it was not always so. In fact, there was a time when they were actually good friends. Nevertheless, everything changed with the Islamic Revolution of 1979. 10 years after Iran became independent in 1943, the United States began to move closer to Iran after helping a group of Iranian military officers stage a coup d'etat and overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. From that moment, Shah Reza Pahlavi, wildly unpopular among the Iranian population, but with strong support from Uncle Sam, came to power. It was then that the friendship between Iran and the United States began to blossom. For instance, in 1954, the Shah granted a 25-year permit to US oil companies to exploit some of the nationalized oil. Later, in 1957, the two signed a nuclear cooperation agreement that became the basis for Iran's nuclear program and enabled it to obtain its first nuclear reactor in 1967. And not only that, in 1972, during a visit by former President Richard Nixon to the Shah, the United States promised to allow Iran to purchase non-nuclear weapon systems if it would commit to protecting US interests against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. However, 1979 came along and the Islamic Revolution turned this beautiful friendship upside down. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, Iran became an Islamic Republic, and the United States became its main enemy along with Israel. From then on, their relationship went downhill and without any breaks. For example, in the first 2 years of the Islamic regime, between 1979 and 1981, the United States had to deal with the American hostage crisis in Iran. Later, Washington supported Iraq in the war that Saddam Hussein unleashed against the Ayatollah's regime between 1980 and 1988. In the meantime, the United States did not hesitate in imposing sanctions on Iran, and in 2002, shortly after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, former President Bush included Iran, along with Iraq and North Korea, in what he called the axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
So, relations went from bad to worse. There was, however, a moment of calm in all this tension. In 2015, 10 years after Iran's clandestine nuclear program was discovered, the United States, the Islamic Republic, and other European countries signed the famous Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a plan that limited the nuclear capability Iran could develop and subjected it to strict monitoring, a plan that fell apart just a few years later. So, you see, in general, the relationship between Iran and the United States over the last 4 decades has been fraught with tension. Yes, it is true there has been some temporary respite, but the reality is that hostilities have never ceased. In fact, these last few years have made the situation even worse. Pay close attention.
An accumulation of problems.
Certainly, there were many who thought back in 2018 that Iran and the United States, at least, had entered a space of calm with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. However, if the world has shown us anything in recent years, it is that we cannot take anything for granted. And that is exactly what has happened with the apparent calm between the United States and Iran, which ended up blowing up.
Trump abandons Iran nuclear deal he long scorned.
In effect, Trump abandoned the program and had created some peace between the United States and Iran. The former president was not going to tolerate any more of what he called empty threats from the Islamist regime. The US was quick to impose tough new sanctions on the regime, hoping that Iran would halt its nuclear program. But guess what Iran has done since then? It basically stopped complying with the agreement altogether. The land of the Ayatollahs intensified uranium enrichment to such an extent that, in 2019, the International Atomic Energy Agency warned that Iran had already achieved 84% enrichment. To give you an idea, a nuclear weapon needs 90% enriched uranium. In other words, in 2019, they were already on the verge of achieving it. That is why a lot of voices started to raise the alarm.
We no longer have a safety distance of a year breakthrough to going nuclear. Iran is 2 weeks from breakthrough, one step away from arriving at 90% enriched uranium, a sufficient amount for a bomb. In order to transform the bomb into a weapon and complete its adaptation to a missile warhead for a missile, about 2 more years are needed.
Faced with this, the Biden administration, which tried to resume negotiations with Iran on the nuclear deal, has continued with sanctions against the Iranian regime, attempting to isolate it further internationally. Yet, this has only ended up reinforcing friendships that the United States would prefer to weaken, such as Iran's friendship with Russia. You see, although Iran would have preferred closer ties with China, international sanctions have proved to be an uncomfortable obstacle to its relations, as China does not want to risk losing the huge trade it shares with Western countries. For that reason, Iran has opted to strengthen ties with Russia, another international pariah also hit with a slew of sanctions. Initially, cooperation between these two countries was primarily in the energy field. However, Russia's war with Ukraine has expanded this cooperation to other strategic fields. Check it out.
Ukraine war. US says Iran now Russia's top military backer.
Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Iran has been able to send, according to Ukrainian government sources, about 2,400 drones to Russia. We are talking, in this case, about kamikaze drone models, Shahed 131 and 136, which greatly assist Russian efforts in Ukraine, particularly due to their value for money. It should be noted that while each of these drones cost around $2,000 to produce, shooting them down costs Ukraine, on average, between $14,000 and $15,000. For this reason, both Iran and Russia have committed to building a drone factory inside Russia. Okay, fine, so Iran is being very helpful to Russia, but what does Tehran get out of its rapprochement with Moscow? Well, I think that we could say this move by the Iranian regime is more of a long-term investment in the Russian power. Yeah, that's right. Iran is going to receive advanced fighters, helicopters, and anti-aircraft defense systems. It is also interested in learning how to circumvent Western sanctions, as Russia has done. But above all, Iran is looking to Russia for protection in international organizations, and more specifically, protection from the United States and the European Union. Even so, perhaps the greatest concern of the US government, given the circumstances in the Middle East and Israel, is neither Iran's nuclear program nor its friendship with Russia, but the allies Iran has within the region. You see, when Iran wants to attack a country, it does not do so directly, but through terrorist groups that it finances heavily. The best example of this is Hezbollah. Hezbollah, which we have already told you about on this channel, is a Lebanese terrorist group, a political party that emerged during the country's civil war between 1975 and 1990, and which receives both thousands of missiles and hundreds of millions of dollars every year from Iran. Hezbollah has become Iran's most important ally in the Middle East, as it controls almost every aspect of Lebanon, a country bordering Israel. In fact, this organization has already had a lot of run-ins with Israel in recent times.
Northern border heats up with fresh rocket fire. Hezbollah attacks on IDF posts.
For the time being, Hezbollah has not dared to attack Israel on a large scale, nor to declare war on it. However, the protagonist of the new conflict with the Hebrew state, Hamas, also has strong ties with Iran. It is true that Iran is not as close to Hamas as it is to Hezbollah, but even so, their cooperation dates back to the 1990s, at which time the Islamic Republic began funding the Palestinian terrorist group with more than $50 million annually and weapons that it has been sending through Hezbollah. In 2012, Hamas began bombarding Tel Aviv with Iranian long-range Fajr 5 missiles. In fact, given the circumstances, and as we have told you here on VisualPolitik, many now believe that Iran was behind the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel on 7th of October. But what if it were confirmed that Iran was behind the attack on Israel? And more importantly, would the United States step up and intervene militarily in Iran? Well, let's take a look.
Iran, next US target.
We've already told you that there are certain voices that are whispering that Iran was behind the attacks against Israel at the beginning of October. The Israeli government also strongly believes it. And the truth is that everything points to this being the case. Even so, in Washington, they claim that there is still no solid evidence to confirm Iranian involvement in the Hamas terrorist attack. But whether Iran had anything to do with it or not, what it has made clear is that should the Israeli response against Hamas in Gaza continue, Iran would not hesitate to intervene and start an open conflict against Israel. For many, this would lead to the US joining the conflict on Israel's behalf directly. But why? How important is Israel to the United States? Well, you see, in addition to being one of its best allies, Israel has been of crucial strategic importance to the United States since 1967. In the Cold War, it served as a kind of dike of containment, a forward base against Soviet influence in the Middle East. And today, to a certain extent, it is a buffer against Islamic radicalism and the powers that seek to undermine Uncle Sam's interests. Israel shares its experience, intelligence, information, and, if necessary, it has a whole Spartan force prepared for any contingency. That is why their economic, military, and technological cooperation has been so intense. There is little doubt that if Iran were to attack Israel, the United States would intervene in the conflict. Of course, in recent years, when Israel has clashed with Iran, the response has been directly Israeli, and it has been forceful.
Israel launches massive military strike against Iranian targets in Syria.
These days, however, American concern about an Iranian attack on Israel goes beyond a possible missile strike. Now, there is another totally determining factor that has the United States and the entire Middle East on edge: a possibly nuclear Iran. You see, while it is true that experts indicate that Iran may already have enough 90% enriched uranium in its possession, they claim that it would still take between 6 and 24 months to develop a nuclear weapon. But even if US intelligence assures us that Iran did not reopen its nuclear weapons development program in 2022, the reality is that we cannot be entirely sure whether Iran already has a nuclear weapon or not. We must keep in mind that since the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, Iranian transparency on nuclear matters has been almost nil. And not only that, we must also remember that the assembly of a nuclear weapon can be done perfectly well underground, thereby rendering satellite analysis useless. Obviously, as you can imagine, Israel is particularly fearful of this situation, which could represent the main existential threat to the country by far. In fact, that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu already stated this just a few months ago.
How do you stop a rogue nation from acquiring nuclear weapons? You had one that is called Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It was stopped by military force, hours. You had a second one that is called Syria that tried to develop nuclear weapons, and it was stopped by a military action, hours.
This highly hostile scenario, with the possibility that a potentially nuclear Iran could strike Israel, is something that has many people in Washington on edge. And the truth is that the Iranian issue is getting red hot. The seizure of oil tankers, its support for Russia, its participation in the attack on Israel, and a possible nuclear bomb. There are more than enough reasons for things to escalate. Indeed, many analysts are already considering the possibility of US intervention if violence escalates in the region. But would its intervention in Iran be successful? For the time being, the Biden administration has already decided to prepare for a possible conflict.
US to send second aircraft carrier to Eastern Mediterranean. USS Eisenhower will join the USS Ford off of Israel.
Of course, in the event of wanting to attack Iran, the US would most likely need much more than 2 aircraft carriers, but there is plenty of US equipment in the region, including a huge airbase in Qatar. And we have to take into account that Iran has the largest arsenals of both long-range ballistic missiles and drones in the Middle East. Its armed forces is among the 20 most powerful in the world, surpassing even that of Israel in some metrics. Even so, the United States is still by far the world's leading military power. If you are loyal followers of VisualPolitik, you know that, while not at its best, Uncle Sam's armed forces are still practically unbeatable. Therefore, it is not crazy to think that it could easily destroy key facilities, such as weapons and drone production facilities, or uranium enrichment facilities. However, the US would have to be very careful, because there is a very high possibility that the costs of its potential intervention would far outweigh the benefits. And you may ask, why? You see, if the United States were to intervene, both Iran and its allies, such as Hezbollah, would not hesitate to attack quickly and directly both the US bases in the region and Israel. But not only that, there would also be the risk that Iran would completely close the Strait of Hormuz, causing quite possibly another serious energy and economic crisis worldwide. So there you have it, VisualPolitik community. Relations between Iran and the United States have been hostile for more than 40 years, and in recent years, they have been getting worse. The strengthening of the Iranian nuclear program, the support for Russia in Ukraine, and now the threat to attack Israel have sunk the relationship between the two to its depths. Analysts are already raising the possibility of the United States intervening in Iran if necessary. It has the military strength and support of Israel in the Middle East, but to be honest, it would not be a walk in the park. At the moment, the conflict between Israel and Hamas seems to be in its early stages. Only time will tell if Iran makes good on its threat and if there is a response from the United States. In the meantime, it is now your turn. Would the United States succeed in attacking Iran? Will Uncle Sam be able to shower Israel with money as well as Ukraine? And could doing this also affect the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. And if you like the video, please go ahead and like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you soon.